Hey everyone, today I want to talk about an amazing group of animals, and that is salamanders. And I'm going to talk about 5 different species of salamander that make great pets. Now, really quick, I'm sure if you're watching this channel, you probably already know what salamanders are, but just very briefly, we'll go over what they are. They are an amphibian species, which means they are not a true reptile. They're classified under the herpetile kind of umbrella of the hobby. They are categorized as usually having 3 different life stages: egg, larval, and adult. Typically, eggs are in the water, larvals have external gills and live in the water, and then they metamorphose to their final adult stage and grow until their mature size, then usually, typically, being very terrestrial the rest of their lives, going back to the water to breed and to lay their eggs again. So, now that that's out of the way, let's talk about some amazing species of salamander. To start things off with is one that you probably already saw coming, and more than likely what I'll use for the thumbnail of this video is the most popular pet salamander, although it's not exactly the most populated pet salamander, and that is the axolotl. These amazing little Mexican salamanders are really cool. However, they are fairly unique to salamanders in the fact, although not being entirely unique because there are several other species out there, that they actually never fully leave their larval stage, where they remain entirely aquatic with external gills. Typically that you see in something that is more commonly, at least as far as the American audience goes, for instance, like the juvenile tiger salamanders, i.e. water dogs. Axolotls remain in their larval stage their entire lives. What that actually makes them a little bit unique and makes actually their care for entirely different than the rest of the salamanders on today's list, but something that's really cool. A lot of people kind of get into this hobby keeping with aquariums and things like that. Obviously, axolotls need to be kept in the water. In their natural range, originally, we're 99% sure they come from 2 different lakes in Mexico. It's theorized there may or may not be a third in there, but it's kind of argued and not really cemented in there. These guys are incredibly endangered in the wild, unfortunately. Axolotls, both in the wild and in captivity, are incredibly susceptible to pollution. And with the encroachment and expansion of human activity and habitation, obviously what happens to waterways and areas that animals like axolotls live in, they become smaller, and unfortunately they become polluted. In captivity, these guys, they really can't, and not only in captivity, but in the wild as well, they really cannot withstand high temperatures. So these guys, despite coming from lakes in Mexico, typically the water temperature stays pretty low. And in fact, that's the reason why I really don't have a whole lot of axolotls and never really have had a good time really successfully, actually keeping them, is because of how warm it would still get. I would actually have to purchase a separate aquarium chiller to actually keep them at proper temperatures during the hottest months of the year. So not really great axolotls for JZ. But if you do have the ability to keep the water cooler, i.e. you have air conditioning, then they are a really great pet. In the wild, these guys, again, very endangered. They actually only now live in what they're pretty sure are just little canals and little parts of areas of the one of the 2 lakes. They're entirely gone, extinct from one of the lakes. Unfortunately, it really sucks. However, with the onset of popularity of them in the hobby, there are actually thousands of them that are captively bred every single year. I was even talking to one person who captively breeds them. It's his entire house. It's like a 10-hour job of just doing constant water changes to breed axolotls on the essentially industrial level. So it's absolutely insane. If you ever want to get into actually like the axolotl channels and things like that and talk to the people who breed them, it's a whole other world from all of my snakes and stuff. It's really cool. These guys are well known for their, cute little enigmatic faces, their absolutely insatiable appetites, and they are definitely well known for their regenerative abilities. They have been known to regenerate parts of their tail, whole limbs, even parts of their heads. And that ability is currently being researched by scientists to hopefully be able to use in some aspect with human medicine. Really cool. Now, unfortunately, again, we've talked about them being almost extinct in the wild. The government of Mexico has now declared them protected and are doing their best to hopefully maintain their different habitats. And they've actually become so engrossed in part of the culture that recently, when they did a reprinting of money, they actually put some on several notes. It looks really cute. Axolotls, absolutely amazing animals, but however, if you do want to get them as a pet, I will say absolutely do your research into them. And the biggest thing to remember is they absolutely need cool temperatures and they need very clean water. Really, really great species of salamander, though, however. And I would honestly consider them, once you've done a little bit of research and talked to people who keep them for a while, definitely a beginner level species. Next up, the northern slimy salamander. Now, the slimy salamander is North America's arguably most widespread and common type of salamander. There are actually over 50 different species in the genus, and the northern slimy is probably the most common and the most widespread. They are found across the eastern part of the United States, all the way up into parts of New England and further north, not really too far south into things of like Florida, and then across into parts of central United States like Illinois, Iowa, those type of areas. You will notice a trend with a lot of these salamanders, and that is they are very cryptic, they like it cool, and they can't really tolerate warm temperatures. So the slimy salamander, their normal habitat is essentially moist soil, wooded areas, not always necessarily, but usually relatively close to bodies of water, either slow-moving ponds or rivers, or typically little areas of seasonal flooding created ponds that dry up in the hottest part of the year that may not even be frozen over in the wintertime. So these guys are actually a pretty commonly found species when it comes to herpers, at least in their area. These guys, they're usually living under fallen logs, under rocks, inside of tree stumps, under deep layers of leaf litter, and they're very easily found. They're typically not very large, from head to tail, usually not exceeding lengths of 5 to 7-ish inches. They're pretty slender-bodied, dark color with those cute little spots on them. I think they're really, really cool. They're not nearly as popular as several other different species of salamander in the hobby, but their actual care is pretty simple. Essentially, being so small, you don't need a huge enclosure. I would say probably something larger than a 10-gallon tank, but that's just me personally. A deep layer of substrate that you need to remember to keep moist, not like dumping cups of water into there all the time, but nice and moist with lots of litter, different layers of substrate. Remember to keep it cool. Typically, in temperatures over 80 degrees as a general rule for most North American species of salamander, typically is as high as you can ever want to get at the hot spot or the hottest part of the day. They really can't handle things lower than that. They are not necessarily truly nocturnal, but they're definitely most active at night. Very, very cryptid, so if you're going to do a light, make sure it's a very, very low light, only on one part of the enclosure. They're typically not a species you're going to see a whole lot, but when you do, they are really cute. And honestly, who doesn't love the way that salamanders look? And obviously, the slimy salamander is one of them. And yes, they do get their name for the slimy secretion that they do give off as a predator defense and deterrent. Next is the spotted salamander. Now, when you first look at the spotted salamander, they look very similar to their cousins, the tiger salamander. However, they're a little bit smaller and a little bit more isolated as far as their range goes, and definitely much more cryptid. Now, the spotted salamander is found throughout the eastern and central part of the United States, as far west as parts of eastern and central Texas, and then as far south as to parts of like Georgia and Alabama, and then throughout central and eastern part of the United States. These guys are incredibly cryptic, and in fact, a lot of the time, this is one of the rarer species of salamanders that herpers will actually even be able to find, because they typically aren't found very often. They're a chunkier looking species, obviously, like a lot of the North America's terrestrial salamanders. They look very, very similar to some of the more common thought of ones as well. They are known for their very dark gray to black skin. They don't have claws, and they always hide under debris and leaf litter. And then obviously they are yellow to orange spots. Most of the time they run in 2 rows, basically from their head all the way down to the tail kind of meeting down, and it goes down into one little row. However, they do vary in both size and amount, and they don't always end up being in straight rows. It's just a pretty common thing for the species. In the wild, you really don't see these guys too often, if I haven't made that clear at this point yet. And in fact, a lot of the time that you only ever really see these guys, unless like you're really digging for it, spending a lot of time out there, is typically during one specific time of the year. And that is late winter to early spring, right when the ground really starts to defrost up, or that hard layer of frost on the ground really starts to kind of come up, raining starts, and that is essentially the start of the spotted salamander breeding season, where not quite to the level of like the tarantula migration that we're all familiar with, but adult spotted salamanders will leave their winter burrows that they use from like shrews and moles and voles and rotted tree stumps and things like that. They will leave those winter habitats and they'll make their way back to these kind of stagnant seasonal rain-formed ponds, and that's where they will lay their eggs and start the life cycle over again. And typically that's really the only time that people will be able to find these guys in the wild, which probably aids to the reason why they've never really grown in popularity, despite the fact that they are not quite as large as the tiger salamander, are very easy to keep. Again, just remembering deep substrate, moist substrate, low light, and cool temperatures. Really, really cool species of salamander, absolutely adorable, and typically these guys are one of my more favorite species of. However, I've actually never really kept them because, remembering harkening back to the axolotl conversation, a lot of the times it gets a little bit too warm in a lot of the buildings that I can actually keep these guys in the temperature range that is really the best for them. Well, we already kind of talked about them, so let's bring up tiger salamanders, our next. Now, the tiger salamander is North America's largest terrestrial species of salamander. Obviously, things like hellbenders get quite a bit larger, but those guys are aquatic, so, yeah. But the tiger salamander, these guys actually can come with a little bit of controversy. And mainly the thing has to do with exactly what the different species are and their actual historic range. Depending on who you want to argue with, right now it's basically kind of divided into two different species: eastern tiger salamanders with a couple different variations of subspecies in there, and then the western or the barred salamanders that we have over on the western and more into central part of the United States. And they have different subspecies. So for instance, tiger salamanders native to Colorado, those would be the barred tiger salamanders. The ones that you'd find over in, say, like Missouri or in Virginia, those would be the eastern tiger salamanders. And they do have separate taxonomic ranges and names. So if you want to argue with me about that, I'm just letting you know. I'm not claiming one way or the other. That is the more prevailing common theory. These guys are absolutely amazing little animals. They, again, like all the other salamanders, are nocturnal, very cryptid, like cooler temperatures. However, the tiger salamander, both the eastern and the barred, can tolerate a wider range, not only temperature, but also humidity. These guys are almost entirely terrestrial, 100% from the time that they are metamorphized into their adult form. Very often you will see them in areas where there is no standing bodies of water whatsoever. Typically, as people, we'll often find them down in like rain gutters, under the porch, and places like that, especially in the spring, early summer, and then into late summer into parts of fall. So basically kind of the ends of their active range. They are amazing little animals. They are, again, the largest species of North America's terrestrial salamanders. They can actually achieve lengths of almost 12 inches. Typically 7 to 9, 10 is fairly commonplace, but they do get pretty big. They don't have little nails just like before, but they do have kind of primitive-like teeth that they used to bite on and eat invertebrates like earthworms and soft-bodied invertebrates and things like that. Really, really cool. And then, honestly, the main reason why there is some less controversy with the two different ones is because that specifically more with the eastern ones and some different subspecies of the bards is the introduction and hybridization of them. Especially in their larval or juvenile form, the water dogs, when they still have those external gills, kind of like the mud puppies and the axolotls, is they are used as common bait. They will use them as live bait for sport fishing like bass and perch. And those will be in bait shops all across the country, and they sometimes get off and they're introduced, or they just get dumped out by people who run the bait shops. And so you end up with different hybridized species of tiger salamanders that are not only hybridizing with the easterns and the blotch together, but also with other species of salamander in their genus in other parts of the country, like more towards the northern parts of like Michigan and Minnesota and northern Ohio and parts of southern Canada and places like that, where there are even populations of entirely hybridized animals, and it's a whole thing. As well as the fact that, unfortunately, tiger salamanders are actually relatively immune to the chytrid fungus, which can wipe out a lot of amphibian species, as well as they're also natural carriers of ranavirus, rana being kind of like the Latin for frog, asterisk, that can wipe out entire populations of other salamanders while just hurting their own populations, but not entirely wiping them out. so not really great. However, if you want to keep them as a pet, they are really, really cool and fairly easy. I myself have had a couple in the past. They were given to me because you can't go out and wild collect them here in Colorado. But again, admittedly, was learning while I was doing it, and I probably didn't have them set up the best way possible. I probably didn't have enough substrate for them. Even once I upgraded their enclosure, the pair of them that I had still probably needed a little bit more floor space because, again, they do get pretty big, and they eventually ended up going to a nature center down the way. And I know one of them is still kicking around, too. I got them both as fully formed mature adults. One was about 6-7 inches, and the other one was almost 10 full inches for the couple years that I had them. Really, really cool, but again, you just got to remember, keep their soil nice and moist, plenty of leaf litter, plenty of hides, low light, low levels of both heat and high humidity. So, gotta love these guys. Really, really Last cool. On the list is probably my favorite species of salamander, and that is the marbled salamander. They're one of the smallest species of the genus of mole salamanders, which includes mole salamanders, the tiger salamander, and the spotted salamander. Typically, these guys don't get longer than about 4 inches long, and they prefer the more cool and the more moist habitats than a lot of their other counterparts. They actually range farther north naturally than a lot of the other ones into parts of New England, and they can even get down into parts of northern Florida where, it can get pretty cold with the whole dropping iguanas thing. These guys out in the wild, typically you will not see too often, usually in the summer and fall months when there's lots of precipitation, and that's when these guys are a little bit more active because, again, they prefer cooler and moister times of the year and habitats. If you want to keep these guys as a pet, it's pretty easy relatively speaking. They don't need very, very large habitats whatsoever, even compared to the other small salamanders, because they are so small. A 10-gallon tank might be good enough. You can argue with me if you want. They could be pretty good. I don't know. I think a 20-gallon is kind of like my bare minimum for most species anymore at this point. Again, cooler temperatures, very, very low light, very cryptid, basically nocturnal animals, soft-bodied prey, lots of layers, moist. And that moist is actually really the main thing when it comes to the marbled salamanders as well as the temperature. And in fact, in the wild, it's those seasonal rains that we've talked about, like remember about the spotted salamander, those seasonal rains are 100% necessary for the marbled salamander's natural breeding cycle. Those seasonal floodings of those temperate pools that pop up that are gone within about a month or two, that's where they do a lot of their breeding cycle. And in fact, they have a relatively short metamorphosis life cycle from egg to juvenile to adult, even when compared to the other mole salamanders, as well as they typically don't live quite as long, usually in about kind of 5 to 7-ish year range. Typically, the larger salamanders like the tiger, we're talking 8 to 10. I've heard anecdotal stories of living more than 20 years, but they're all just hearsay, nothing really documented. If you guys have all had tiger salamanders or other species of salamanders for long periods of time, let me know in the comments, because I would absolutely love to hear about that, because I would really like to gather that. But it seems like the consensus is 10-12 is a really old tiger salamander, and about 5-6 is a very old marbled salamander. Supposedly the marbled salamanders are sexually dimorphic. When you look at their marbled coloring on their backs, supposedly the males are more white and the females are more of a gray color. Absolutely beautiful little animal. Although, fun fact, these guys actually, when they first metamorphose to their adult stage, they're not that really cool marbled pattern on their backs. They're actually more like the kind of blue spotted or spotted salamander, not spotted, slimy salamanders, where they're still that darker coloration, that kind of dark gray, purpley black, although they usually do get darker as they get more mature. And then it's really lightly spotted, and then it just kind of grows and goes into that really beautiful marbled pattern. Absolutely amazing species of salamander. So for these guys, as well as all the ones on the list that I mentioned today, obviously with the exception of the axolotl with their own separate husbandry, always remember cool temperatures, thick moist substrate, clean fresh water, keep handling to a minimum because they are amphibians. So despite the fact they're walking around on the ground all the time as adults, still not really great to handle them. So even when I had my tiger salamanders, most of the time I was using gloves and keeping handling to a minimum. You won't see them very often, but hey, sand boas are really popular and you almost never see those guys either. So if you enjoyed today's video, please like, subscribe. If you can, check out my playlist of top 5 animals here. I have talk about plenty of those other ones. If you guys want to hear me talk about anything, have a conversation, ideas for future videos for the top 5 for Species Spotlight, please let me know. I always do write them down in my notebook. It may take me a while to get to them. If I can do them, I do like to have better video more than just straight pictures for you guys, especially for the Species Spotlight. So for the people that have asked me to do, like hognose or giant hognose or some specific type of African tree snake, I'm trying to find down people who will let me video their really cool animals. And hey, if you have any of those and you want to be part of that with the whole shout out and say, hey, these animals are owned by such and such, email me. Let's talk. Let's collaborate. Let's do this. So again, hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video. Thank you all so much. Hope you're having a great day, and we'll check you next time.